Well, as introductions, we've met Ivy and Brianna, but yeah, our guest and co-host this evening is Pam Miller, and Pam's the executive director here at Alaska Community Action on Toxics, working on state and local issues. She's also the co-chair of the International Pollutants Elimination Network, dealing with national and international pollutants and pesticide issues. So in addition, a 30-year plus resident of Anchorage and a gardener here in Airport Heights.
I'm not that old.
But what I'm trying to say is we're lucky to have such a knowledgeable and kind of dedicated individual here, a champion for human health in our community. So thanks heaps, Pam, for joining us and making the time to share with us tonight.
Oh, glad to do it, Nick. Thank you. And thank you, Ivy and Brianna, for being here. So we'll just keep this really informal. I have a short presentation, but then mostly we can just have discussion and conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick, and hopefully this will work. There, can you see that?
It looks good.
Okay. Great. So we would like to just begin with the land acknowledgement that we are located on the unceded lands and ancestral lands of the Dena'ina peoples, and Indigenous peoples of Alaska have never surrendered their lands or resources to Russia or the United States. So we would like to honor the Dena'ina people here. And I'm trying to get my slide to move. There we go. Okay. And just briefly, this is the mission of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. We're an environmental health and justice research and advocacy organization. And we also try to offer healthy solutions, which is why we have the Yarducopia program to offer organic gardening alternatives for people in the community and to promote safe and healthy growing and good food and food security. And I just wanted to also start off with a remembrance of a wonderful writer and scientist, Rachel Carson, who you might be familiar with, who wrote Silent Spring in 1962, and I think it's still very relevant to us. And she really talked about contamination without our consent, and that people really have a human right to clean water, clean air, toxic-free food. And she said that the Bill of Rights didn't contain a guarantee that a citizen shall be secure against lethal poisons, but that is surely because our forefathers, despite their considerable wisdom and foresight, could conceive of no such problem. So at the time of the founding of our country, this problem was not really understood and didn't really come about until during and after World War II, with the proliferation of many, many thousands of chemicals by the chemical industry and pesticide industry. I'm not going to dwell on this slide very much here, but this is just an overview of the law that regulates pesticides in our country. It's called FIFRA, or the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide and Rodenticide Act, and it was enacted in 1996. So it's very much really outdated and doesn't unfortunately take into consideration the latest science that really looks at the environmental and health effects of pesticides, including neurodevelopmental deficits. There has been a lot coming out in the scientific literature over the past several years about how pesticides can affect brain development, can disrupt our hormone system, and can cause immune system problems, which in this time of COVID is especially concerning. And most pesticide products are approved innocent before proven guilty, so they can be on the market for many, many years before any action to restrict certain pesticides take place. And they're reviewed only every 15 years. So there's really a long gap. And so they're not, the regulation of pesticides really does not consider the most current science. And it also does not consider always the peer-reviewed scientific literature. The EPA gets information from the pesticide manufacturers, and oftentimes it's this vested interest science that is considered when pesticides are being regulated and often re-registered. And again, scientific understanding has really proliferated, I'd say, in the last 15 and 20 years, especially. And although some of this understanding has led to restrictions, these actions to restrict have sometimes taken place after really decades of harmful use. And I'll give one example, and that is the insecticide chlorpyrifos, which is one of the most widely used insecticides in the world. And as an example, it used to be used in the Anchorage School District. And because parents and teachers were very concerned about these applications, we worked to get the Anchorage School District to pass a least toxic pest management policy. But not until after we found out that chlorpyrifos had been used really for years inside schools and on the school grounds. And then later, EPA restricted it for indoor use because of its neurodevelopmental effects on children. But again, thousands and millions really of millions children were exposed during the time that this pesticide was approved before it was more widely restricted. And it's still not completely banned. It's used quite a lot in agriculture. So farm worker communities are very highly exposed to this chemical. And that's just one example. One thing I wanted to mention, again, I'm not going to go into detail about all of these, but toward the bottom, it talks a little bit about inert ingredients. And these so-called inert ingredients generally make up about 90% of a pesticide formulation. But the EPA, in the interest of industry proprietary interests, does not require disclosure of these of these inert ingredients and how they affect human and environmental health. So this is really a huge problem and a real lack of the public's right to know. So oftentimes these inert ingredients are far from inert, and they have sometimes very high toxicity. They can have a range of environmental and health effects, including some of the ones you mentioned above: endocrine disruption, carcinogenicity, cancer-causing, neurodevelopmental toxicants, and so on. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has been quite concerned, especially about exposures in children, and have recommended additional information on labels and ways to protect children. But EPA has really not taken those under advisement or implemented those. So hopefully with this new administration, things will be different. So
Can I
that's
ask a quick question on the inert?
Sure.
I guess I'm just confused. Could you define how inert is determined? Does it just mean that it's not acting on the, I don't know, the weed that they're trying to use it against, or like what is the definition of inert?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the EPA divides the ingredients into an active ingredient and a so-called inert ingredient. And by inert, they just mean that it's not the main pesticidal substance in the pesticide formulation. So it can, really, it can include things that help. They're called adjuvants that help propel the pesticide into the environment. They can include chemicals that help the pesticidal ingredient penetrate into cells. It can include, for aquatic pesticides and herbicides, it can include chemicals that are generally petrochemicals that help spread the and make the pesticide more soluble in an aquatic environment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that definitely helps. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, the term inert really is a misnomer because they are far from inert, but it just means the ingredients that are not required to be disclosed on a label. If you pick up a container of pesticides, you'll see the active ingredient there. So for example, with Roundup, the active ingredient is glyphosate, and that comprises maybe 10% of the entire formulation, and the rest are non-disclosed as inert ingredients.
Yeah, that seems especially inapplicable if you're trying to look at effects beyond just the thing it's acting on. Then of course, things that are labeled inert may not be inert to everything.
Yeah, exactly. And there have been a number of scientific studies that show that compare the toxicity of, say, the labeled active ingredient with the entire formulation, and oftentimes the whole formulation is actually a lot more toxic, and there are synergistic effects with these inert ingredients as well. These are just a few more points about inert ingredients, that they're biologically and chemically active and labeled inert because of their function in the formulated product, but they do increase the ability of the pesticide to affect significant toxicological endpoints, including these ones listed here. And they can increase exposure because they make the pesticide more penetrable into our bodies and into the bodies of fish and wildlife and other organisms. So they can decrease, if you're a pesticide applicator, they can more effectively penetrate protective clothing and gear, increasing their mobility and persistent, and increase the phytotoxicity of pesticide formulations in plants and toxicity in these many other organisms. So again, far from inert. So one of the things that groups like ours are working toward is to get full disclosure about ingredients in pesticide formulations as a right to know issue. And we certainly know that pesticides, and when I use the word pesticides, I'm including herbicides, fungicides, mycocides. Pesticides is just the general umbrella term for chemicals that are used to kill unwanted pests. So we know that children are especially vulnerable to pesticide and other chemical exposures, and they can harm the structure of the brain, causing lifelong damage. And we've heard a lot about lead toxicity, and pesticides can also affect the neurodevelopment of children. They're very vulnerable because their brains are developing quickly. They have a larger volume, body mass to volume, and so they're breathing more air. They're generally spending more time on the floor or on the ground, and have a greater likelihood to ingest because of their hand to mouth and just exploring their environment. And they are now, pesticides are now known, it's fairly well established in scientific literature, that health outcomes in children, including cancer, birth defects, early puberty, are some of the outcomes where the evidence is especially strong. And there's a lot of emerging science on this, and exposure to pesticides can contribute to childhood asthma, obesity, and diabetes later in life. And these exposures can cause significant health outcomes at very, very low exposure levels, and can be passed from mother to child in the womb and through breast milk as well. So there are intergenerational effects of pesticides that we have to be concerned about. These are some of the ways that pesticides can harm salmon, which is why one of the reasons why we've worked really hard in Anchorage, really to protect our watersheds. We want to protect children and all the people in our community, but we also care about fish and wildlife and all of the other creatures that live with us here. And there's quite a lot of science as well about how pesticides can harm salmon at fairly low exposure levels. And with runoff, when pesticides are used on yards and public parks, they can wash into the streams and really cause long-term harm to our salmon populations. So now I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we have in place here in Anchorage in terms of ordinances that protect us from exposures to pesticides, and then maybe some ideas about where we can go beyond what we have in place already. So in 2004, we worked very hard to get the municipality of Anchorage and the Anchorage Assembly to pass an ordinance that we called the Pesticide Right to Know Ordinance. And it requires enhanced notification. It requires notification at least 48 hours prior to and remaining in place 48 hours following a pesticide application, and then also posting in public parks. This really came about because we started getting calls fairly early on when Alaska Community Action on Toxics was formed, about people noticing that there were trucks spraying pesticides, broadcasting pesticides, somewhat like those historical photographs of trucks, spraying DDT, but spraying them in the middle of the night in our parks, along the park strip, for example. And people were really concerned about that. And spraying pesticides through high pressure hoses in the town square park. And so, people were concerned because they weren't at that time, the municipality was not required to notify. So, for instance, if they came in the middle of the night and did this high pressure spraying of the trees and the plants in the park, and the next day you went to have your lunch there, or you brought your children there to play, you wouldn't necessarily know that pesticide residues were all on the trees and the lawn of the parks, and you could be exposed really without knowing, and your children could be exposed, or your dogs and other loved ones. So this was one of the reasons that prompted us to really fight for this ordinance that requires notification. And you may have seen these notices. Like I said, before 2004, no notification was required. This requires notification if your neighbor or someone with an adjacent property within 150 feet of where you're living, if they plan to apply pesticides using a certified applicator, then a notification is required. They have to provide a notification at your door. So this was a big step, but we know it's not enough. But a right to know provision is a really important first step toward exposing the level and types of pesticide applications that are being made, so that then we could gather evidence about this and then ultimately call attention to it even more and reduce the use of these pesticides in our community. So then the next step really was to do something that a lot of municipalities around the country have done, and that is to enact an ordinance we call the Pesticide-Free Anchorage Ordinance. And this, again, strengthens the public's right to know, but more importantly, it institutionalizes or codifies an approach that focuses on prevention rather than just using pesticides. And it has a whole series of measures in place that have to be taken before pesticide use is even considered. So it really requires a more holistic and preventative approach, things that enhance the soil, that increases a plant's resistance to, and really just precautionary measures that then preclude the need for such high pesticide use. And when we started looking into this, really, it was quite shocking how much pesticide use was happening within the municipality of Anchorage. And we did quite a lot of research through Public Records Act requests, and there were some very dangerous chemicals, pesticides being used in our parks. So we think this was enacted in 2017. So it took quite a lot of time, but very important. And I think it will and has really reduced the pesticide use in Anchorage. And now you don't see the broadcast applications of of pesticides in our parks, and it's reduced at, I would say, probably about 98% in our parks. So we now have safer parks. And it was one of the things really that led the municipality of Anchorage's Parks and Recreation Department to decide against the use of glyphosate or Roundup and other herbicides to control Mayday trees in our along green belts along Chester Creek, and have worked really in favor of a more holistic approach to that issue of so-called invasive plant. And that was my last slide. So I just really welcome conversation. And again, thank you so much for joining.